stands in their name.
Uh, Grand. Am I visible and audible?
Yes to both.
All right, fantastic. You guys, unmute yourself and bother me because I'm not looking at chat. This is a controversial motion. I'm not going to say anything crazy, but just all the content warnings and trigger warnings apply. Um, Time starts in my next word. All right, just some setup. What do we mean by war is likely to break out? I think two possible scenarios here. One is that the North and South directly engage in hostile maneuvers against each other, i.e., a border crisis escalates into a regional war. Or you have some kind of regional collapse in the Asian Peninsula, i.e., larger geopolitical battles between the US and China over something like the South China Sea, or Myanmar, or border crises between India and China result in proxy war escalations that then turn into an escalation ladder that result in the Korean Peninsula also engaging in hostilities. Or there's a big enough chance that groups within the two countries create an escalation ladder. So, for example, just as an analogous example here, in Rwanda, there's not exactly a direct war with the Congo, but the M23 is a Congolese funded group that is causing violence in the Congo, which is provoking a reaction from the Congolese government. So there's a sort of hidden war taking place between the two countries. I think something similar could happen between North Korean groups like infiltrating South Korea or likewise resulting in an escalation ladder. The first scenario, therefore, is the why it's likely that this relationship between the North and South is breaking out. And there's a number of things to analyze here. Firstly, is that North Korea is likely to go through a succession crisis soon. Kim Il-jung is getting old and has shown many indicators showing that he is like going to leave power soon. Given that there's going to be a change in leadership, the greatest power in the country lies between military power brokers, non-state actors who are aligned with the military, and the larger military industrial complex. The easiest way to gain buy-in and to sort of maneuver into sort of taking over that power vacuum is to provoke and create reasons to expand military spending. Insofar as the military complex has, pushed for Kim or has like Kim has had to maintain these relations with North Korea's military complex, with North Korea's military industrial complex. We think it's likely that in a position where Kim leaves and there's a succession crisis, the power vacuum and the competition between those brokers creates the chance for conflict. And if conflict within North Korea doesn't arise, I think there's an opportunity for South Korea to step in and neutralize what it could see as a threat in a sort of preemptive self-defensive maneuver. The second likely scenario is the second reason why we think this type of issue is likely is because there have been shift in the internal policies of the North and South. So firstly, within the North, Kim has made a declaration that unification is no longer a feasible approach, right? They made this declaration, I think, in February of last year, where they said that we're no longer that the North is no longer pursuing unification and thinks that it's no longer something that is worth pursuing, which means that there's no more mediation, there's no more likelihood of peace talks to declare the armistice to finally be over, or there's no more negotiations between North and South. In response, South Korea's Army Chief Shin Won-sik had their declaration in October of last year, which was like something that went along the lines of immediately, strongly until the end. I.e., South Korea has shifted what was in the past for decades a defensive stance into one that can be read as aggressive. And the important thing here is that while South Korea might not necessarily want to intend this to be an aggressive stance, and they said that it's not aggressive, the North as a regime has often felt vilified and alienated by the rest of the world and is likely to read this stance as aggressive, especially given the fact that part of this stance has been an expansion in US and South Korean joint military exercises expanding and also in modernizing the South Korean military in response to what they see as the North developing more and more destructive capability. And what type of destructive capability are we talking about here? Firstly, the North has declared that they have ICBMs that are capable of reaching the Western world's borders. They also have hypersonic missiles. In the last 2 years, North Korea has therefore developed the capacity to break through, one, the US nuclear umbrella and break through US missile defense systems. The important thing about time here is that the North knows that this advantage in military capability is only available for a short amount of time before the very advanced military complex of the US is able to adapt and counter these advances that they've made. They know that the US knows that they have ICBMs, and they know that the US is likely developing capability to counter them, so they have a short time period in which they can use them to their best advantage. to their best advantage. In response, we have two things that we know about South Korea. One, that they've expanded its own missile programs to counter those things. And secondly, we know that their GDP percentage into military has doubled in the last like 5 or 6 years, which all of which is to say that there are increasing shifts within North and South internal policies that show that, the chance or likelihood of war breaking out, or at least some sort of aggressive stance being taken, is increasing. But also within the South, there are changes in the public sentiment, i.e., the politics of South Korea becoming more and more amenable to war breaking out. Firstly, we know that the largest opposition party in South Korea wants to push for nuclear armament. You don't push for nuclear armament unless you feel like there's a real capability of threat happening. At the point at which the North has always maintained that its nuclear weapons are a form of deterrence against the South, a world in which the South now pursues nuclear weapons is one that pushes the North to feel even more afraid and even more likely to retaliate in a way, for instance, trying to do a decapitation strike to take out South Korean abilities to develop nuclear programs in the first place. Finally, the other thing I want to talk about is that the US's ability to temper the South is also flailing, right? So the new Trump regime is one that's increasingly isolationist. What we know is the precedent from last time is that they have tanked mediation between those two, i.e., Moon Jae-in's Sunshine Movement was uniquely tanked by Donald Trump refusing to show up to those mediation talks, which means that the US's ability to temper any sort of South Korean aggressiveness or North Korean aggressiveness is also one that we cannot rely upon anymore. Second argument is that North Korea's geopolitical room to engage in hostility is also improved. But before I do this, I'll take up PY from opening.
Weapon is not the only criteria you need for a war. You need stable economical power. This is what you don't have for North Korea, and South Korea are better than it.
Fantastic question, and that's just what I'm going to talk about. North Korea's geopolitical room to engage in hostilities improved. This is to say three things. One, China and Russia have increased military trade between the North with North Korea. In the past, China and Russia engaged in humanitarian or grain-based aid, i.e., giving trade to North Korea based on agricultural goods. But what we've seen is an increase in military capabilities and military exchange between the two. But also, other countries have increased trade with North Korea too. Cuba, numerous BRICS countries, and uniquely Palestine, where North Korea has sold Sayong missiles to help the Palestinian resistance against the against Israel, right? Which means that North Korea now is emboldened because the world is slowly shifting away from complying with sanctions. And uniquely here is that the shift in BRICS and de-dollarization has meant that SWIFT transactions are easier to maneuver away from due to the rise of things like cryptocurrencies, back channels, and illegal black market trades, which means that North Korea no longer has to rely on the international order, keeping it isolated. It can now rely on new trade partners who want to shift away from a rising US tide, which means that the North is in a far more economically stable position than it was in the past. But there's larger geopolitical factors here as well. China and Russia have also become more emboldened, i.e., interference in African elections by Russia increased by 17% in the last 5 years. The Sahel region and all of the coups that have taken place have explicitly taken pro-Russian stances. China is increasing lobbying power in Panama even, which means that the US is uniquely afraid of China's presence, China's increasing global presence, and they have become more emboldened. I think in this world, North Korea is in a uniquely good place to be able to engage in any kind of stance that it wants to. I've run out of time, but proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech and to welcome the leader of the opposition to begin the case for opening opposition. Hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Right, just give me a quick time. I start my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For over 70 years, the Korean Peninsula have fought into arguments of war, whether it start or not, but the line of the war never been crossed by any of one of the party. When tensions and also threat escalate, the history itself have proven one most important thing, which is that the war are the least likely outcome in a status quo because the war greatest power that they are born by the economical interest by their neighbor country and the fear of the mutual destruction of the neighbor country as well. They will not allow the peninsula and also which is South Korea and North Korea itself to enter into a war. This is not the questions about if war is possible in a status quo, but the question becomes why is a war does not happen or it will not happen. Two main response towards case coming from side OG. OG tells us two things. North Korea were very likely to enter the war because of their entering the successors crisis. Do note that the South Korea practiced the long precedent history on the next successor or the next ruler are usually the son of the previous ruler. This looks like Kim Jong-un are the son of Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il is the last ruler of North Korea then, which makes Kim Jong-un the next president or the ruler of South Korea. Which means that following this president, it is a very likely outcome that Kim Jong-un's son are likely to become the next ruler. Although there's no positive and also although there is no positive and also like news about whether Kim Jong-un have a son or not, but there is a news coming from South Korea authorities that actually Kim Jong-un itself have 3 sons. Therefore, it is an historical precedent that you usually succeed by the son of the previous ruler then. But the second response towards the argument is they tell us that North Korea itself, they are very offensive. There are multiple types of weapons, and there are precedents about how they're going to interfere into like weapons and nuclear weapons, etc., etc. But to note that weapon is not only the only criteria you need for war. You need stable economical power. Although OJ explained to you how they expand their international relationship with Cuba, with countries like Israel, with Palestine, etc., etc. But I want to note that the only pathway for you to enter North Korea commercially is through China. It's through railway and also flight. We'll tell you that China as the most important actor, and with Russia in today's debate, they are unlikely to make North Korea itself to enter into an unbalanced power of war compete with South Korea then. That's all for responses. But do note that before I end it my framing and also my analysis, 2 things you must note that. 1, South Korea are usually practicing the pro-peace belief, which they seldom attach into the provoking of war together with North Korea. But to note that North Korea itself, they have actively provoked South Korea into war. Therefore, we can say that the only party which is actually pushing for a war, and also it's basically from North Korea then. But why this is unlikely to happen during these 5 years, which is the end of the decade? Internally, from an internal factor then. 2 things. 1, it is a very short time frame. The term when they explain to you when there is end of the decade, which means that the war must be happen in the next 5 years. This is unlikely to happen because the war and also the war and also like this is a very unlikely outcome because the war itself and also the bad relationship itself between North Korea and South Korea are unlikely to upscale between the time of 5 years then. But the second layer of analysis, Trump administrations in the 5 years time, this is in the 5 years time as well, which means that the Trump have an active precedence on how he dealing with North Korea itself. They have a precedent, the Trump administration have the precedent of stopping North Korea into being actively engaged into a provoking of war with North Korea before. Trump have taken positive action to North Korea in previous administration and will expect the almost same outcome in the next 5 years of Trump administration as well. But going into external factors on why neighbor countries and other external factors will stop them from stop North Korea to provoke and also to enter into war then. First argument. 1, economic interdependence and also global diplomacy act as a stabilizers by the big countries. This is true. 3 reasons. 1, South Korea is the 10th largest economical body in the world. They're heavily integrated to global trade and also like global trade, which is that they're incentivize a lot of countries to not make North Korea and South Korea to make it to the war. Basically, this is because the war will devastate the entire global economy of the global economy. Then the United States, China, and Japan, all these neighbor countries have a very deep economic interest in Korean stability. Therefore, this makes war irrational. To understand, I already explained to you that how this is the link between China and also North Korea, which is the only pathway for them to enter into North Korea, right? Which means that even North Korea depends on China for economic survival, means that it cannot afford to provoke a war that might lose the help and also support from Beijing. This is very irrational because you lost your help from the big power, your neighbor power, which is likely to help you in the most immediate time, right? But why this is good? This is good because this is good simply because why economic independence prevents war? 1, a war will basically stop the global supply chain, especially in semiconductor and tech industries, causing a worldwide economical crisis. We already see it on the shortage of chips and semiconductor during the Palestinian and also Israel war. But the second reason is that the United States don't want another large-scale military engagement to be engaged to it after the Afghanistan or the Iraq war. The third thing is the economical incentives push all parties towards a conflict avoidance and diplomatic resolutions. This is important. This is important because there's no major power benefit from the war. Do note that everyone's powers are profit incentivized, which means that if there's no major power benefits from the war, every country involved will suffer economically, which means that there's no one wanted this war to be started. Therefore, this proves the unlikelihood of the war to be started. But the second reason then, the China and Russia, as the most important actor, will prevent the war for their own interests. This is true because of two reasons. One, China doesn't want the instability on their border. This is because a war in North Korea will lead to millions of refugees flooding into China because China is their neighbor country. Russia is also increasingly aligned with North Korea, but they want to avoid direct confrontations with NATO and US because they have failed to do so. This is good. They will prevent war. Two reasons. China wants to maintain economic and political control over the regions. Therefore, a war that's happening right now will destroy its ambitions to do that. But the second thing is a conflict in Korea will force China into unpredictable military confrontations with the US, which is unlikely to risk for China then. But thirdly, Russia is already in stretch within the war with Ukraine, and they cannot afford another major war again. This is important because of two reasons which will prove that this is unlikely to happen. Two things. One, the Korean Peninsula remains as a very strategic battleground, but all the major power want to keep it cold but not hot. They don't want the fight to happen in their region because no one gets significant benefit. But the second thing is, this is unlike the Korean War that used to happen before. Because the modern China and Russia are far more integrated into the current global economics, means that they will prefer diplomatic over stability over war. With all these reasons opposed.
I'd like to thank the Speaker for that fine speech and to welcome the DPM to conclude the opening government case. Hear, hear.
Hello, visible, audible?
Both, yes.
All right, two things. One, I fashioned up for this final, and that should matter because style has points, not really. But two, opening opposition really misidentifies how two big, large actors behave when they come to compete with each other again on resources. Their big assertion is because there are valuable resources / the region of Asia / the Korean Peninsula is important for China and USA, they're going to behave extremely responsibly in a way that doesn't endanger the global supply of rare earth minerals. The problem is this is never how either of US or China have behaved. And generally, history tells us that when these major countries have tried to compete with each other over resources, they've often done so in militaristic ways, especially from the US's end. I'm really unconvinced why they're going to act peacefully. Everything about the South China Sea, the Arctic region, generally scrambled for Africa in the modern century right now, tells us that these countries are often extremely involved in trying to bid against each other, even if it means instability for the local region. I'm really unconvinced as to why that wouldn't happen in this scenario. I'm going to refute a couple of their assertions, and I'm going to move forward with two new arguments, hopefully. Number one, their assertion that succession will be smooth. I want you to know how ill-informed they are, right? Like Kim Jong-un does not even have a son. I want you to know that Kim Jong-un's best position right now in order to get a successor onto like his seat is him trying to get his daughter through. There are three structural reasons, however. Number one, the Kim dynasty generally doesn't have the kinds of singular power it used to back in his father's and great-grandfather's generation. What do I mean over here? Initially, because Kim's family was one of the few families who actually held power and militaristic control in the region, they were able to occupy and centralize power quickly, i.e. they had to make deals with just a few generals, and over each succession, because they held most of the power, they were able to get it done by the way they wanted to. This is no longer true. Power in North Korea and Kim's dynasty has generally weakened, i.e. power has moved from just Kim's family to other militaristic stakeholders. This means that getting the successor you want through is now much, much more tougher than it was before. This is exclusively why North Korea has a successionary crisis right now, and why Kim is trying to give as many concessions as he can to try and get buy-in from his generals. This is uniquely why he gave up on any efforts to unify Korea, because he wants to appease his warmongering generals. This is a bit like Netanyahu in Israel, right? Like, yes, Netanyahu is crazy right-wing and like leading a genocide, but the rest of the parliament or like the Knesset around him is significantly worse, and what he's doing is brokering deals with them in horrible situations, but it could be worse. Similar thing for North Korea, right? We think post Kim Jong-un, it's extremely likely that the many military power brokers who are trying to take power, who are trying to take control, and in the absence of Kim Jong-un's own personal military or like political influence to keep his successor on board, there's going to be a fight. Their assertion that succession will be smooth doesn't stand. But next, their idea that the USA and Trump specifically, they say is going to be able to like chill the situation out. There are three reasons why US's ability to be involved in this crisis has significantly fallen over the last few years and will continue to do so. Number one, the US's economic hegemony over the region especially has gone down. As China has become more powerful in this region, the US is no longer the primary trade partner for this region, i.e. there are less US money, US soldiers, US ships entering into this region. Countries want to sell off less and less to the USA because they know China is the more important regional partner here. Why is this important? This means that US's ability to maintain naval bases in the countries it does right now, South Korea, Japan, etc., get weaker when they don't have the kind of money they need to support those financial bases. And number two, when they can't make the countries host US soldiers by keeping them economically dependent on them. We tell you, as China's power increases with the trends, the Asian countries will depend more and more on China relative to the USA. This means China gets significantly more emboldened / can make countries in Asia act much more in the way it wants to. I want you to note two pieces of framing over here. One, China has been extremely aggressive in trying to get USA military presence out of the region. It's done so for a long while in South Korea, but two, most importantly, in the South China Sea, China aggressively continues sending its own ships into the region just because it says that the US's military presence in the region is completely unacceptable. We think the stronger China becomes and the greater an ability it has to get US forces out of the region, the more it will do so. We think as more countries get more beholden to China, it becomes tougher and tougher for them to keep the US involved. This means that South Korea's ability to depend on the USA to keep helping them, to keep pressurizing North Korea goes away. Number two, we tell you US is just getting more isolationist, and this is just not a Trump thing. We tell you as more and more countries do things like de-dollarization, as things like BRICS keep forming, as things like US's own prioritization over occupying things like Greenland, or over making sure that their trade deficits are solved, over making sure that they're more interventionary in wars, etc., is proof that the US is just not interested in maintaining peace in the global world. They're not doing so in Ukraine, which is much closer to their borders, against a much more traditional villain, i.e. Russia. Why would they do this for the Korean region? Do not interrupt me, POIs in the chat. Next, USA is also just like pulling out of the Middle East, etc. Regions where it previously never thought of pulling out of. Afghanistan, the Middle East, are regions where it now no longer wants to exist. This is crucially because the US no longer is interested in maintaining through military its hegemony on the world. Notice this is the only thing South Korea depends on, because neither China nor North Korea want South Korea in that region to prosper. We tell you, as soon as USA goes away, North Korea gets emboldened because it knows now is a unique opportunity to attack South Korea, because who knows whether or not the US is going to remain this weak 10 years later. But also China knows that it has a unique comparative advantage right now, because of which it can act uniquely right now and will not be able to do so later, which is why it will continue to act. Closing opposition, POI.
Are you really saying that China will feel so emboldened that they'll bomb US army bases in Korea?
That's very silly. That's not what we're saying. We're saying they're going to pressurize local countries and give them economic incentives to give less and less land / deals to the USA to maintain their bases there. Yes, a lot of these bases have long-term deals by which they can continue doing there. And yes, China will have to pressurize domestic countries to a large extent to break those deals and get USA out. The problem is that's already happening. So a lot of African countries, for example, at the behest of China and Russia, are kicking out French military bases, are kicking out American military bases. We see no reason why South Korea or regions in Asia wouldn't do the same, especially when China is much more proximate to Asia than it is to Africa. If China can get France's exit out of like Africa, where France was much more closer, much more involved, we see no reason why it can't do the same for USA involvement in Asia. I want you to note just two more things over here. Number one, we tell you that given that these tensions between USA and China are likely to increase in the future, we think Korean Peninsula is an obvious area where this is going to play out. Why? Number one, it is extremely close to Taiwan. Number two, it is the hotbed of the South China Sea issue. We think that in any situation, you need South Korean and North Korean land to keep a lot of military strategic points. One, you need a lot of Taiwanese control to get all of the REM/commodities that you are fighting over in the South China Sea. These are the biggest spaces where USA has involvement. If the USA chooses to fight with China, and we're not even saying China would win, we're saying if the USA chooses to fight China in any of these places, it has to use South Korea, which is its biggest military base in the region. The point at which USA uses South Korea's military base, China has no option other than using North Korea as its proxy. At that point, you have the Korean Peninsula at wars. It's extremely likely being able to predict that China and USA won't fight each other in that region in the next 10 years is downright impossible. So happy to
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech and to remind speakers to respect POI preferences as well as to stay under 7 minutes and 15 seconds. With that being said, DLO to conclude the OO case in the top half. Here.
Hi, I just want to check if I'm audible and clear.
Yes.
All right, just give me a few seconds and I'll get started. Oops, sorry, crashed for a second there. I'm back. Just give me a few seconds and I'll get started. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening governments never inherently engage with Yenju's push to talk about the short time frame in which these events need to happen and don't actually directly respond or engage with all of Yenju's analysis to tell you why North Korea in and of itself is not equipped with all the necessary equipments and the necessary circumstances for them to want to engage in a productive war, but secondarily, why there also just isn't necessarily people who are like open to like actors, foreign actors coming in to be willing to support this thing happening. Yenju already provides you a lot of mechanisms to explain why the general gist of how this is going is one that's not inherently favorable to a lot of your external countries that are bordering it, like Russia and like China, who have no incentives to want to A, continue to inherently support or encourage this war, but B, are likely to take an oppositional stance in order to mitigate and like deter all of these things from happening. A few things I want to do in this speech, right? First of all, I just want to quickly contend with a small tense here coming from OG. On one hand, they tell you that the US and China are likely to get involved in large scale like wars over like things within this like Korean peninsula region. But in the very same speech, like from PM, they also tell you that the US is inherently protectionist and are unlikely to get involved in matters like this. A few reasons why any relations or any conflicts potentially between the US and China or anything interrelated to these two parties are unlikely to manifest within the South China region, which even if that's nearby the like Korean peninsula. One, note that there's no real benefit for the US in actually executing these things aside from some form of optical showcase towards China in that of itself. But secondarily, there's a general reliance on a lot of chip productions that are happening within these regions because a lot of your global powerhouses in terms of microchip productions are also occurring in this area. There's no actual economic incentive for the US to want to directly go and perhaps engage in conflicts here, like especially with such a big producer like China and like countries like South Korea in that of itself, and to deter that production in that of itself. Why then is there still an incentive, even though the US are still going protectionist? A few questions I'm going to answer in this speech, and I'll explain to you what the probabilities here are. I'll take you later, don't worry. Okay, first question in this speech, which is why the fact that there's prevalence of conflicts in these nearby regions already mean that there's a general awareness that deters the idea of conflict or deters the North Korean side's incentives to want to get involved in conflict. Note, bordering country Russia are already in war with Ukraine. This means a lot of aid has already been trickled down and a lot of soldiers and a lot of unity between a lot of countries within this block of the world. This looks like organizations like NATO and other like parties getting involved within the situation in that of itself. Why is this then counterproductive to what North Korea probably want to do in terms of this like war within the Korean peninsula? Because at best they probably want to take over land that they historically think that they sought over due to like one Korea and all of that. The reason is because of the nature of how North Korea has always inherently operated. This is always or generally always been a very closeted or a very low-key country in terms of their operations, which is why a lot of North Korea's activities or engagements are things that are oftentimes unreported and are oftentimes things that are hard to forecast. This means that the point in which the North Koreans pick this particular 5-year time frame of like period to get involved in conflict is one where they directly put themselves in the limelight, directly exposing themselves to a lot of parties who have already have a lot of aid and a lot of like war materials within this location, because this is a region that is historically over the past like 2 years or so been flagged out as a region that is inherently contentious for war because of neighboring Russia and other conflicts that have existed. Why is this counterproductive? This means that it's inherently already a threat to any attempt for North Korea to want to pick this period in order to execute these things because of the likelihood of backlash, because of the likelihood of things like actual action being taken against. I'll take you later, don't worry. Second question then, as to why this time frame becomes the actual tipping point in this debate. Note that irrespective of how the Trump administration works, national security or just global security is something that Donald Trump has inherently always been very protective about, right? For example, during his last term, there was probably one of the only terms when North Korea was really deemed a very neutral actor throughout periods, because Donald Trump literally went up to North Korea and literally told them like, yo, you can't do anything. It's like, really, I will blow you up. Like, these are periods of time where Donald Trump inherently engaged with these actors in order to directly mitigate them because of how radical this man is and how concerned he is about the fact that any form of implication between such an unknown and predictable actor like North Korea could impact things like this. The fact that the point in which North Korea even has a slight likelihood of contemplating this is one that's likely to induce Donald Trump to take such actions. Why is this then again an issue for North Korea? No, it's because historically North Korea has never had such opposition or such like fixation placed on them by a foreign actor that directly like monitors or like is actively challenging the actions that they want to do. This is something that I'm exclusively bringing to you because it is during these 5 years that Donald Trump's term is likely to expand largely over. Why is this relevant in the debate? It's relevant because if North Korea were to pick a more strategic time, I don't necessarily think they would pick one where the most vocally oppositional person to them has actively voiced out over them over the past 8 years. They'd be more strategic of them to pick a time, even if they were to, that was absent of this individual who is insanely obsessed with military defending. But before that, sure.
Praveen, you are lying to everyone on the panel. Trump literally is accepting nuclear weapons within North Korea. Why is his intentions in the past 4 years and currently the same?
Donald Trump is only going to act insofar as there's a threat to the global security. There's not a whole lot he can do about the fact that North Korea is holding nukes because there's no actual benefit to him if at the point in which like Kim Jong-un tries to use these nukes is the point in which there's an incentive for him to want to do this. This is already a mitigatory benefit. Stop lying to me too, Eitan. Third question in this speech, why burdening countries are unlikely to let this happen? Yanju posits to you why there's no incentive for Russia and China to want to do this. Few reasons why. One reason why China is likely to even get involved to help deter and mitigate these things from happening, because China has precedence of intervention with North Korean affairs in the first place. Note, Yanju characterizes to you that one of the only outlets into North Korea for trade and etc. and involvement is China in that of itself. What does this then mean? There is a risk on the Chinese side, which is a large economy that's actively trying to grow and gain monopolies throughout the world, to get impacted, the point in which there is a risk of this conflict escalating into their lands or directly impacting their ability to trade with other parties within the region. This is problematic because one, China's not going to like this, but two, their historical ability to interfere or deter North Korean affairs is something that's already largely productive, which means I'm unclear as to why they wouldn't do this again. This is a third factor the North Koreans need to consider. Last question then. And why is this just bad? Like, why is that just further incentives for this to deter North Korea? Yanju posits you trade incentives, losing support from countries like Russia and China, things like potential economic incapabilities, the point in which you lose this marginal trade that you've only recently been able to make, the point in which you lose the support is likely to deter the sustainability of you to take action against this war. What am I proving to you then at the end of my speech? I'm proving to you that there's no benefit in North Korea taking these actions now because there's no inherent benefit or incentive for other actors to want to let this be justified. But secondarily, there's better time periods outside of this decade, even if they were to do this. For those reasons.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech and to once again remind speakers over 7 minutes and 15 seconds, I will verbally stop you and panel will stop tracking. That being said, I'd like to invite the member of government to begin the case for CG. Here.
Hi, just checking I'm audible visible.
Yes.
Cool. Before I start my speech, I haven't been in a final in a while, so like shout out to Imran, shout out to Anna, shout out to Joelle, my debate partner, shout out to Sunway, shout out to Malaya for getting to finals finally together. But yeah. Right. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The preface of this speech is that I don't really know what a predicts motion predicates, right? But I assume the way in which you're able to prove whether or not something is likely to happen is probably how you're going to win the debate. So we'll give you a bunch of reasons why it's likely going to happen, then we probably win, like, I don't know, I'm guessing. But the way in which CG is going to come into this debate is then quite simple, right? We're going to fight the frame from opening benches and weigh the likelihood of all scenarios in manifesting and which facts are probably true. But I think what you'll notice is that this debate is very parallel. People are just saying, yes, this is true, or yes, no, this is not true. What will come in in and say is that, okay, it doesn't matter if either of you are true, all of it will lead to war because all of it leads to the resulting next 5 years being the worst 5 years of our lives. But the second piece of framing is that the end of the decade is the next 5 years. Notice what actually matches this time frame is the US, or like Donald Trump being in power. You notice how it's the 5 years in which you probably have the most wars because there's been the most wars in this 10 years is decade, right? Yeah, in this decade rather than the last 30 years or even 80 years since World War II, right? Likely what this means is that this is gonna continue to degrade or continue to escalate in very, very problematic ways. And that's what we're gonna prove from CG. The first 4 extensions in the speech. The first is just explaining the declining diplomatic positions, which integrates responses to OO. And I think we have to talk about US influence, right? Because after the Cold War, South Korea became the main hub of US influence in Asia, right? That's where all of their money goes in. That's where, K-pop comes in. There's so much US influence there. But I think importantly as well, that's where all the antagonization from China, from Russia, from North Korea has been focused because they don't like this US influence in this area because that means it stops them from taking things like Taiwan or South China Sea, which likely just means on their comparative or on both comparatives actually, people just don't like South Korea. But let's talk about Trump then, because Trump is in power for the next 4 years, so assumably he's going to be very, very important. But there's multiple things that we need to talk about under Trump. The first is just whether or not he wants another large engagement. Dude, he wants to take over Gaza and take Greenland. I'm pretty sure he doesn't really care about imperialist ideas. But the second thing here is that he said he wants to let North Korea keep their nukes. So no, Praveen, you would allow people to have nukes if you want them to have peace, because it's much easier to broker international peace if you force them to not create nukes. If it's true that on their side of the house they want to maintain some kind of international peace, then they wouldn't have done things like tariff every single country in the world. They wouldn't have done things like threaten to kick Mexico out of the border and engage on border warfare there. So it's likely that they no longer have any reason to be the international broker of peace and democracy, especially when Trump is willing to become far more isolationist. For that reason alone, it's all the more likely that this is the only time frame in which war can happen, because Trump is the most radical actor that could ever exist within the next 50 years. You're not going to kick out your entire governmental administration and say oh, I'm just a fine guy, I'm just a chill guy. No, that's just not gonna happen. B, let's talk about Chinese influence, right? Because it's pretty clear why there is a Chinese desire to establish control. So how they keep saying they want to go to take Taiwan, how they want the South China Sea, how they hate American influence in Asia. I think there's a very large reason for them to want to go against the US. But I think on top of this, you have things TikTok, right? Or things like the trade war between China and the US, which largely just means that the US and China don't like each other. I really don't know why you're going to try and say the US and China like each other. But even more so, Taiwan is also in that region, right? So if North Korea goes to war with South Korea over here, that means over here you can go attack Taiwan as well, because you're combined forces, so likely it's easy for you to wage war. See, let's talk about Russia, because I don't know, somehow OO has talked about this. I don't know, Russia is already in war. They're also imperialists and want to reclaim their former land. So I should assure you they have no problem with this. But the last thing to note here is Korean influence. Because note, in the previous term of presidency, right, South Korea antagonized North Korea by saying they would send preemptive nukes, or how they wouldn't recognize North Korea if they didn't denuclearize and stuff, right? You look at how there's things like rubbish bombs between the two nations and stuff. They're not a low-key country. Brother, Praveen, they are the center of global news. Just read more, right? You have increasing nuclear programs on both sides. You have the martial law that happened in South Korea. All of these things lead to a declining in both states, which likely means you're going to get into far more war. The second extension then is just the international inclination into war, which is just a sort of status quo analysis, because note how there's just a lot of violence nearby in both time frame and regionally, right? You look at Russia and Ukraine, you look at Israel and Palestine. The common denominator is a reclamation of foreign land and an imperialist attempt to recreate a former country. Wow, does that sound familiar? It sounds like Korea, right? So this means this is international trend towards a declining global state makes it easy for you to engage in war because everyone else is doing so as well. You can engage in war because everyone else also gets into war, so no one near you is going to stop you or can't even stop you because they're in war. So likely all of this means that it's far easier for you to do so because of the international situation. I'll take a point from closing. Opening?
Eitan, I just yet for 6 minutes to explain to you why China will stop North Korea. They won't just start the war just because they got the nukes. This is a direct challenge towards China. Trump and US are not stupid.
What? what are you saying? Like, China is going to want to do so because they don't like America, they don't like Taiwan. So they're likely going to support North Korea if they want to stop US intrusion. Like, you don't give us enough structural analysis on why the US are going to evade all of, or like not going to evade all of this. Why exactly this is going to be a very like important thing to them, likely because they also have other interests they need to care about in terms of like the extremely large tariffs that are going across the world, and on top of how like Trump is besties with Kim Jong-un, right? So probably not gonna happen. The third and probably the most important extension, which like so just listen out, is the idea on Korea's decline. So it's not just military escalation. We'll flip ops analysis on needing economic stability and explain what is the tipping point, and when like North Korea becomes so far worse, it's far worse on up, and therefore you're going to create a lot of war. Few things here. Now the deepening economic like problems within North Korea, right? So like endemic food and energy shortages, the creation of black markets, for example, likely this weakens the strength of the North Korean government because the people are economically suffering, so you weaken their strongman image. But number two, not how they like a sharp weakening of decades of indoctrination, right? Look at how they kill people who watch K-pop, like killed his official for watching porn, right? Like, I would be dead 10 times over within North Korea. Guys, Kim Jong-un is batshit crazy. Let's emphasize that your rational reasons don't matter when you don't bother to explain the incentives of Kim Jong-un himself. Because Kim Jong-un will be in power, he has too large of an ego to like give it up, unless like North Korea is in like a good place, which it won't be. And he has no like successor as well, which I'll explain later on. But see, there's a growing inability to sow like increasing fear into its citizens, right? That's why we have more and more people running away and settling in South Korea. But the last thing is that he also has no successors. He killed his brother in OO's country, dude. Like, apparently, like, he has a daughter or something, but she's like 10, right? So you can't be able to recreate their regime. All of this means that North Korea is going into decline. And what do you do when you go into decline? You wage war, because it's your last attempt to reclaim some kind of power, last attempt for Kim Jong-un to be himself. For those reasons, CG.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech and to welcome the member of opposition to begin the closing opposition case. Hear, hear.
Wait, bro, how do I?
Push it to the side.
My bad. Hey everyone, my name is Justin. He, him, POIs in the chat, please. Don't interrupt me. That would be really mean. So don't do it. In closing opposition, we will show why politically it is untenable for both South and North Korea to pursue a policy of warfare. If I prove firstly that South Korea has a low likelihood of doing so for political reasons, that explains why there's a low possibility that North Korea will be provoked into also committing to warfare if there are no shows of force. I'll talk about two things in this first extension. The first, the US willingness to contain North Korea is going to fall drastically under Trump. This responds cleanly to Gov Bench. The history of this motion is that Biden compelled Yoon Suk-yeol to normalize and deepen relationships with countries like China in order to contain North Korea. Biden specifically had a very clear foreign policy of containing nuclear threats. That's why he actively tried to normalize these sorts of relations. It's why he actively subsidized the battery factories in South Korea, such that the US became South Korea's largest source of investment uniquely under Biden's term. This was all important because he needed to actively compel Yoon Suk-yeol to want to bond with Japan over deep existing historical animosity. The problem then is that I'm going to give four mechanisms as to why Trump does not possess the same willingness to necessarily contain North Korea. Firstly, he obviously cares a lot more about Americas and China. Marco Rubio is not a North Korea hawk, Marco Rubio is a China hawk. Secondly, Trump is nominally relatively friendly with Russia, who is North Korea's BFF. Putin also infamously has some degree of influence over Trump. It's likely that Putin would like to preserve North Korea's standing if they don't get invaded, so he might be able to convince Trump to, not get South Korea to invade North Korea. Thirdly, he often likes to be seen as a peace broker, and that responds to closing government. He just ended the war in Gaza. He wants to end the war in Ukraine. That goes against his previous rhetoric if he incites a war on the Korean peninsula. But fourthly and obviously, he wants to create a distinction from what Biden did. So if Biden compelled Yoon Suk-yeol to be extremely anti-North Korea, he will compel the next president to do the exact opposite. This is important because South Korean citizens broadly hate war because it's destabilizing, and they hate allying with Japan because of historical animosities. The US was required on-site government to actively nurture South Koreans' willingness to even fight against North Korea to begin with. I've demonstrated that the US, if does not have that capacity or willingness anymore. But second, I want to talk about the South Korean government. The two mechanisms here are as follows. Firstly, the Democratic Party, who is going to become in charge after Yoon Suk Yeol, their official stance is to be less hard on North Korea to decrease military spending for the reason that CG gives. If the economy is crumbling because of fucking chaebols, if there are social issues like a declining birth rate, the logical thing to do is to take away from the military budget and to put it into these sorts of issues. But second and pertinently, the legacy of Yoon Suk Yeol, who was incredibly hard on North Korea, has now become universally hated after his coup. He cannot, the successor, continue any of those policies lest he risk getting impeached by the courts, lest he risk getting voted out at the next election. How does this compare all these political reasons on, the US and South Korea's part to OO's reasons of economic interdependence as to why the South Korean actor is unlikely to wage war? What we posit in CO is that economics doesn't dictate foreign policy. Leaders often implement policies based on things like personal belief, based on historical precedent. Economic policy is simply one set of a pro or a con that comprises leaders' decision-making calculus. The evidence for this is that Trump knows that tariffs on Mexico and Canada are going to fuck over his economy, but he still does it because he believes in it. So on government, they very well could say that the South Korean leadership or US leadership could justify a lot of military aggression because of the nuclear threat, because of the historical animosity between the two Koreas, but we posit in closing opposition that the Democratic Party that will come to power does not want to pursue war, Trump does not want to pursue war, and these political considerations are more proximate to decision makers within this debate, because war worsens their legacy politically. It's bad that these are the actors that caused war to restart after 70 years, and people don't want war. They want, therefore, to directly appeal to people who elect them into power. There's a more proximate reason than what OO gives as to why this war is unlikely to occur from the South Korean perspective. Let's move on to North Korea. The problem with Gov Bench is that it's just fucking unclear at the end of this round why he is insane Kim Jong-un. He runs the longest military dictatorship. But more pertinently, it's unclear why he is willing to risk his currently comfy position. There are a few reasons why he's unwilling to risk it, or why he fears what would happen if he actually incited tensions. Firstly, as I proved in the first argument, if South Korea decreases tensions to a North Korea has less of a reason to inflame tensions towards South Korea. But secondly, he currently already has total control over his population. There aren't really rebels. OG doesn't actually give reasons for why those military threats are going to topple his rule. The point then is that they already have nukes, they already have allyships with Russia and China, so it's fundamentally risky to launch war from the North Korean perspective because they know that they'll probably lose even with nuclear weapons, because then South Korea will bulldoze the heck out of them. At the very least, even if North Korea wins, we know that the Kims will not stay in power. And the end of OG, at best, you believe that the military successors might come to power and might stir chaos. But it's unclear even at this point in the round why any leader in North Korea cares at all about bombing South Korea. Why don't they care more about concentrating the existing amount of power they have and leading nice, cushy lives where they get to take vacations in things like the Bahamas? No one needs to signal their political purity by invading South Korea. At best, they have shows of force, they have demonstrations, they send balloons over, but none of that will ever escalate to war, not least in the next 5 years. OG.
The salience of OG case is that we don't rely on militarization alone. It's that Russia and China want to influence Asian governments to push US bases out like they do in Africa, which creates hotbeds for escalation or room for North Korea to feel emboldened.
Okay, notice the link that OG doesn't make. At best, they show that there's some incentive, but not even the capacity to strongly influence the Korean peninsula towards higher tensions. Even in that world, the jump to saying that war will break out, that the nukes will launch, that guns will go off has not been sufficiently proved. Maybe they hate each other a bit more. I've given you political, structural reasons why that's unlikely to happen. My analysis in this extension outweighs opening opposition and actually the top half debate generally. Russia and China may or may not have sufficient influence over North Korea. They may or may not want war to occur. I contest that my argument has a lower burden of proof. It purely explains that the leadership of North Korea, whoever it is, just doesn't want to wage war because they're already doing okay. It doesn't require that many burdens of proof. It should be bought over anyone else in this debate. At the end of this speech, China genuinely is also not important, speculative. Everything everyone says is speculative. The things I've said are the most certain, because geopolitics is a game of people. What they feel, what they desire, and what they want to happen. People don't want this war to happen, and therefore it probably won't.
I'd like to thank the Speaker for that fine speech and to welcome the Gov Whip to conclude the CG case and the Gov Bench. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Uh, okay. Okay, so shout out to KFDI, to Lodge, to Eitan. Yes. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. It is extremely funny that we're debating this like debaters who can sit around in a circle and argue on the structural reasons and the reasoning behind each decision, when at the end of the day, what we're supposed to be doing is analyzing the incentives between each of these leaders at the specific points in this time and understand whether they are likely going to wage war. Onto a few like characterizations on CO, right? They tell you basically a few things. Firstly, they tell you that there's no like remaining incentive for both sides in order to like go to war, right? Firstly, aggression is also on the side of South Korea, right? They don't need to aggress to the point of war. They just need to be annoying enough. Firstly, there are existing reasons to want to reclaim South Korea. Like, okay, let's look at the nuclear situation in Korea, right? North Korea has conducted many publicly known nuclear drills with intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can fire great distances and whatever. Such nuclear power is therefore a large threat to basically every country in the world. And notably, North Korea has passed a law to declare itself a nuclear weapon state and rejected any possibility of denuclearization. South Korea has already said they don't want to work together if they can't denuclearize. But secondly, we also tell you that South Korea specifically has responded to this by improving their own military. Their military aid with like and training from the USA, right? They have tech from the USA that's designated to protect South Korea, and this has agitated North Korea. But secondly, let's talk about Kim Jong Un for a while, okay? Because the fact that CO wants to postulate that Kim Jong Un is an incredibly comfortable position is ridiculous, right? His country is declining, he's losing power. All the analysis that Eitan already gave you already leads to the conclusion that he's probably not doing okay, right? He's losing more and more power, and primarily to him and his huge ego, he's losing his strongman image. And primarily, the strongman image is required for him to remain as a dictator because no one can threaten his power as long as he maintains some form of control. Okay, but onto like the premise of the bad political decision, and this is where we like point out to you, right? Let's talk about geopolitics. It is funny that the most speculative thing in this whole debate is what CO is speculating, because they speculate whether people might or might not want to do, which then leaves them in debater land, right? Every other team has analytically shown why there has been a descent into a likely war, so sure that people may not want to have war, but then you see the reactions of international actors and what may occur. Onto OO then. Let's talk about what they want to say. They said that having like North Korea waging war is going to lose support from Beijing because China doesn't want it to happen. Firstly, Eitan has told you multiple structural reasons for why China does want this to happen, right? We've told you incentives for them in the trade war with the US and the regional influence that China wants to spread in the East Asian region, right? But secondly, even if this doesn't matter, we've also pointed out to you that the fact that Kim Jong-un has his own incentives and therefore has his own reasons to wage the war means that this doesn't really matter to him, right? And we'll be talking about this in more detail later on. But secondly, they tell you that North Korea is afraid that they're going to get attacked by other countries or threatened, right? Firstly, they really have no other alternative, right? They're in a really bad place. They're getting economically beat up. Kim Jong-un is at the helm while all of this is happening. They're fully dependent on their allies like China and Russia because they're getting sanctioned by the rest of the world for their nuclear program. But firstly, I'd like to answer the question on why China and US will encourage a proxy war, right? And this deals directly with or that they don't. Firstly, the fact that a war has been encouraged by the US already sets precedent, but this is because they can sell more weapons, right? The more that a proxy war like the reason why the US has encouraged proxy wars in the past is because the more suffering the occurs, the more the US can have trade deals to sell more firearms and weapons and therefore make more money. But secondly, the fact that the China and US are ideologically opposite has already set precedents for the many wars that they have waged in the past. This means that they have asserted control over places in the past because they wanted to maintain regional influence. South Korea is historically a place with Western influence, and North Korea has historically been a place where they were backed by China. I think that is not a logical leap to assume that China and US do have incentives to want to spread regional influence in a place where it is extremely precarious. But considering all of this, right, why is a war then likely to happen? Let's look at Kim Jong-un for a second and actually analyze what his incentives are. Kim Jong-un, first and foremost, is a strong arm leader, right? But secondly, we tell you that he's not likely the most rational. Don't just ignore this analysis panel, because this means that the analysis they give you about all the rational reasons why Kim Jong-un might or might not wage war doesn't matter if Kim Jong-un doesn't think things through rationally. We tell you that this evidence by the propaganda he spreads, right? He makes people stand up when he's around and clap. Everyone must keep a portrait of him in his office. And he kills people, and he killed high-ranking military officials for no reason, even though it caused a military gap. And he mandates that everyone must do certain things when he's around. The reason for this is not because he's a perfectly rational leader. It's simply because he's a strong-arm dictator with a huge ego. So secondly, we tell you that the reason why war is likely going to happen soon is because Kim Jong-un needs to save face, right? The US recently elected Trump, which then means that they have an aggressive military policy, which then means that they are likely to want to maintain military influence around the world. Before I move on to why we edge out OG, point.
No, I don't understand. If North Korea want to launch a war, who's the big papa behind of North Korea? US have no incentive because they invested in South Korea. It's different with Iraq and Afghanistan because UN don't give them a shit in Afghanistan.
I think you're ignoring my analysis on why, like, China. Okay, look. Firstly, China has been the one funding North Korea's nuclear program. That's something we need to agree on, right? So we have to understand that China has been backing it for like things that are related to war. But secondly, we've already given you analysis on why China wants to maintain its regional influence and why places like the US are likely going to back South Korea. But thirdly, I think you also need to engage with the analysis that Kim Jong-un himself has incentives to wage war. So it's not just that Kim Jong-un is a puppet on strings, right? He has his own incentives to wage war, and it's something that you cannot ignore. But onto OG then. Why do we win over OG? We're the only one that talks to you about the incentive of Kim Jong-un to engage in war in South Korea, right? We've told you analysis on why him as a person would want to rationally reach the conclusion in order to wage war in South Korea. We tell you that, like, unlike what OG says, Kim Jong-un is likely not going to cede power until he actually dies, right? OG straight up lies to you here, right? When they tell you that Kim Jong-un is going to cede power. Firstly, it has a huge ego. But secondly, he knows that North Korea is getting fucked right now. You cannot, like, expect him to cede power in a position where he's going to look really bad, right? This analysis is important because it takes precedence over all the logical reasoning that every team wants to bring today. You have to analyze the people on the ground and the decisions that they want to make. You have to analyze the incentives of the main person in charge that is going to wage war. You can take this at, even like if you take all the analysis at their best, it doesn't matter if you realize that the analysis doesn't really matter to the only person that is responsible to waging the war, and we're the only ones that show the incentives for why he's going to do so.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech and to welcome the op whip to conclude the op bench, the back half, the CO case, and the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Can I check if I'm audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to start off by noting that the burden of proof in this motion for government bench is extremely high. They need to prove on a balance of probabilities two things. Firstly, that a war, and not just a mere escalation of tension or conflict, but a full-out military conflict is going to happen. And secondly, that this will happen by 2030, by the end of this decade, which gives them a runway of about 5 years for this to actually eventuate. Neither government teams actually discharge this burden, and that is why they're out of this debate. I think importantly, their case requires you to buy or believe many logical leaps that they don't actually explain versus buying CO's case, which is just if you believe that the material facts that we have explained to you exist and you believe the actor analysis that we have done, it is probably likely that these individuals would not want to escalate war or instigate war to begin with. Firstly, I'll talk about CG and then OG and then how we weigh above our opening. Firstly, CG. I think their main contribution is to say that in the next 5 years, this timeline coincides with the Trump presidency, and Trump wants to instigate war because he's irrational and he's crazy and he's radical. I have a few responses to this. I think firstly, this is simply not true, right? Understand that Trump, as of taking office, has been shutting down wars. He's been pulling out of Ukraine. He's been stopping the war in Gaza. But more importantly, this is a lot of political backlash from his domestic constituencies about US intervention in Afghanistan. His presidency in 2016 was the exact presidency that began the process of pulling out troops from Afghanistan. This shows that he doesn't really care about intervening in other people's proxy wars. But thirdly, a lot of his policy and a lot of the reason why he was voted in this election was because he propagated a messaging that he cared about protectionism and a focus on domestic affairs. He didn't give a fuck about other countries because those don't matter, and he wants to put Americans first. Understand that this is antithetical to whatever logic or lack of logic that side CG wants to give you. But I think importantly, their case requires you to buy a number of hoops that just simply don't, like, the logical leaps are extremely large, right? Firstly, they have to prove that the US has the capacity, then they have the incentive, and then secondly, that North Korea or South Korea will compromise on their domestic political legitimacy for some sort of nebulous interference by these two actors. I don't think that they discharge this burden at all. Moving on to OG and how they lose. They provide three main points. The first is that because of changing leadership in North Korea, there's a power vacuum, and this will lead to an instigation of war. I think intuitively, I want the panel to notice that this is just simply an argument that doesn't make sense. Kim Jong-un and the Kim dynasty literally run an authoritative dictatorship. They own control of the media, which is to say that even if there is political dissidence, these dissidents will literally be shot on sight and be unable to propagate any form of messaging. But even if this succession is disrupted or the Kim dynasty is weakened, understand that when they talk about other military brokers that enters, it is unexplained. Firstly, why these other parties will have the incentive to start war once they occupy power within North Korea. But secondly, we contest the premise of this entirely. What these people will be interested in is stabilizing their support base and holding on to power. And this will probably occupy these actors for the next foreseeable 5 to 10 years. So it's unlikely why the first thing they'll do once they step into office is to immediately instigate war against South Korea. It's a completely bogus claim. The second thing they say is that the capacity of North Korea to instigate war has increased because their economic development is relatively better than it was 10 years ago. OO has tried to respond to this, but I'll just add a few layers of response. The first thing to say is that South Korea has literally 10 times the GDP of North Korea, and military expenditure per capita in North Korea being higher is not indicative of their capacity to wage war, because once you wage war, it's a continuing expense and you need to focus all of your economy onto it. Once that happens, South Korea is likely going to succeed, and Kim Jong-un is a dumbass if he doesn't recognize this. The second thing to say is that they simply don't have strategic allyships anymore. Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine and wrapping up the war in Ukraine. China is simply facing a lot of domestic issues currently. These actors have no incentive to intervene or back North Korea against their war against South Korea. But before I move on, I'll take your point from opening.
War results from a confluence of factors. You're too focused on North Korea. We talked about regional proxy conflicts spilling over to the peninsula, rising hostility from both sides leading to a spillover of hostilities. You need to engage with the larger scenarios that we've given you, not just some analysis on Kim Jong-un.
Okay, yeah, sure. I get that a big part of your case was about China or US puppeting up proxy wars within the North Korean peninsula. I would want to point out to the panel that I don't engage with this argument because it is an extremely ludicrous argument to be making for a few reasons. The first thing to say is that it doesn't meet the burden of proof that war will break out. Even if you believe that these actors have some form of incentive to economically manipulate these two countries into starting war with each other, that only proves that tensions will arise. But more importantly, they don't prove the incentive or capacity of these two actors. The only thing they say is that China is interested in the South China Sea. They don't contend with the fact that China's economy is currently in a crisis. Investors are pulling out. Chinese firms are losing global market share, especially in light of Trump's tariffs placed on China. It is unclear why they have the incentive or the capacity to intervene in this way. So to buy their claim, you need to buy that all these things will happen, and you need to buy that it will happen in the next 5 years, which is, again, they don't discharge their burden of proof. That's why I don't think that this is a big part of the debate. But lastly, and more importantly, how we weigh up against our opening. Our opening says two things. The first thing they say is that North Korea has no capacity. Secondly, that China and Russia will not back North Korea, and instead they'll present North Korea with an ultimatum and sort of withdraw their economic aid to North Korea if they were to start a war. I think Justin's extension weighs above OO in two ways. The first way he does this is that he presents a dimension of argumentation that says that economics is not the only factor that dictates foreign policy decisions. His extension explains why the motivation of North Korean leadership itself is of one that preserves legacy, and this is antithetical to initiating war. The reason why this weighs above our opening is because OO explains external pressures that does exist, but we say that even if you buy the government framing that perhaps Kim Jong-un is an irrational actor and that he may not respond to these external pressures, we explain that his internal calculus and the way he makes decisions militates against him wanting to instigate this war in the first place. But as Justin points out as well, it weighs up against their argument because this is a lower burden of proof. We don't need to prove that multiple actors and moving parts will act in different ways. We just need to prove that North Korean leadership will not make this decision. Once we do that, we win the debate. But secondly, talking about explaining the incentives of South Korea instead, this weighs against opening, and it's a valuable contribution to debate because war can be instigated by either party. They don't really talk about South Korea. That is where our extension comes in to fill the mechanistic gap. Justin tells you that the newly elected Democratic Party that has a legislative assembly in control and is soon going to be fielding a successor for presidency after Yoon's impeachment cannot follow in his footsteps because he is an incredibly unpopular man, and South Koreans just simply don't align with his views on war or economics or anything. They likely want to show that they're not like him. That is why they're going to propose a policy that's antithetical to what he's currently been doing with collaborating with Biden by trying to be more harsh against North Korea. For all those reasons, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Let's thank the speaker for that fine speech, and all speakers vote was a very, very good and high quality final round.